This is Anil Prasad with Traversing Turtle Island, and who am I sitting with right now?
Alison.
Hey, Alison, thanks for coming out. What park we at right now?
We're at Daleway Park in Linwood, Washington.
Linwood, Washington, just like a little bit north of Seattle, right?
In about 20 minutes, yeah.
Cool. Thank you so much for making the time to come out and talk with us. So, how long have you been in the area? Are you kind of Washington native?
No, I grew up in California. I lived a couple different places when I was a colonizer, better known as a missionary. And then I moved down here about 7 years ago.
Cool. 7 years is a long time. Has it treated you well, the place?
It's pretty good. It's expensive as fuck to live here.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a challenge.
I guess a lot of the cost and living increases have been due to like Amazon and the other big companies around here.
Yeah, definitely. All the tech bros can afford thousands of dollars a month, but the rest of us can't.
Mm-hmm. Have you noticed like an increase in like houselessness in the time you've been here?
Absolutely, yeah. Even like this far north of the city, there's still a lot of unsheltered people around.
Mm-hmm. And for the folks watching, Alison and I, we met at protests and a continued occupation going down in Cal Anderson Park in Seattle, right where the CHOP was in the Capitol Hill area. So, what brought you out that night?
I saw a flyer with future crystals that said we're gonna go to the North Precinct, and I wanted to go. There's been a lot of protests at the East Precinct and the West Precinct, but since I live north is the closest one to me, so I wanted to make that one. And then there was a meeting afterwards. And yeah, Clymer volunteered, or Anil volunteered rides, and I wanted to go, but I couldn't afford gas, so it was perfect. It worked out.
What got you involved with protesting against police brutality, or how would you identify perhaps politically?
I don't really know. Definitely not liberal anymore. Approaching anarchist. It's probably safe to call myself an anarchist. I just need to do some more research before I want to know what I'm claiming to be fully before I identify as that.
How'd you get involved in all this?
Back in 2014, when Mike Brown was murdered, I was in an abusive relationship, and what I learned from my mom is get involved in activism when you're involved in a shitty relationship. Just take it outside of yourself.
What was it about certain protests that you were involved in?
I was at a protest about the acquittal of Darren Wilson, who murdered Mike Brown. And the cops were trying to keep us from getting back to Westlake Center, where our protest had started, which was totally unconstitutional. And I, totally naive and freshly emboldened with knowledge of my white privilege, walked right up to the cops arm in arm with all my white friends, and they tossed a flashbang and it exploded right on my foot, and I was deaf and blind for hours, which was terrifying in that scenario. It was definitely eye-opening to the things that black people and other people of color experience every day. That's a small fraction of what they experience every day.
So you lived police brutality firsthand with someone a cop throwing a flashbang on your foot?
Yep.
Yeah. Did you sustain any long-term damage or wounds from that?
No, I was very lucky. I was wearing boots, so my foot was okay, and my vision and hearing are fine too.
Okay. Thank goodness. And so, how's your activism or involvement manifested over the years since? Because Mike Brown was murdered back in 2014. It's been about 6 years now.
Yeah. I went to a lot of Black Lives Matter protests. They had a Blackout Friday every Thanksgiving in honor of Mike Brown that I went to. And I went to a couple, there's a detention facility for immigrants in Tacoma. So I've been to a couple protests there, and I did the Women's March and a couple other election-related ones, but it's definitely kicked into high gear since George Floyd's murder.
Mm-hmm. Could you maybe talk to folks who are watching about what it's been like here in the Seattle and the surrounding area since George Floyd's murder?
I was there on what's considered day 2 after George Floyd was murdered. In Seattle, it was pouring buckets that day, the whole day, and I met up with a friend of mine from behavioral modification school, which I talked to you about, that I hadn't seen her in like 12 years or something, and she was just here randomly, and we got to go protest together. That was the first time I experienced kettling. There were 2 cars that were lit on fire. One we later found out was lit by the police themselves. And we were trying to get out because they had given an order to disperse. And we tried a bunch of different blocks, and they all said, nope, you got to go to another one. They're blocked by a line of cops. You got to go to another one. And yeah, we couldn't get out, and we were gassed. Eric and I finally found a way out and ran down this alley. And we were like trying to get to the train station so she could get home. And we walked down this completely empty block. It looked perfectly safe, but it was full of tear gas. So we made it maybe 20 feet down the block and had to run back out and find another way. It was wild, and it was pouring rain. We were soaking wet the whole day. Yeah, I definitely saw, there's video of it, but I definitely saw police officers breaking storefronts and cars and things like that, like firsthand saw that shit. Of course I saw other people do it too, but I'm not going to blame them for that. Yeah, then I was there most of that first week. I was there the day that Dan Brown was shot. I was on the other side of the crowd.
Was that Dan Brown being shot, was that here in the Seattle area?
Yeah.
Yeah, could you talk to folks about that who don't know that story?
Dan Brown was a protester. He's still alive, thankfully. I had seen him just maybe 10 minutes before the shooting. Things had been escalating between police and protesters. Protesters had been throwing empty water bottles, flowers, things like that. And police were threatening us in response. And so Dan Brown and a couple other people went up like shirtless and just kneeled in front of the police. They crossed the barrier and just kneeled in front of them. And then like a couple minutes later, the police announced that somebody had been shot in the crowd, and I didn't believe them. I thought they were making it up, to make up reasons to hurt us, basically. But it turned out to be true. The brother of someone who works at the East Precinct drove into the protesting crowd at Cal Anderson, and thankfully was stopped by some protesters who had the presence of mind to move some of the barricades that had just recently been taken down so that people could kneel in front of the cops, move them in front of the driver's car and stop him from actually driving into the meat of the crowd. And then Dan Brown drove up. The guy had a gun out. Dan Brown walked up and grabbed his arm and tried to control the situation and got shot in the arm for it. Then the guy got out and was just walking around with the gun. I think he pointed it at a couple people, and then he walked towards the line of police. He gave them a thumbs up and was peacefully arrested by the same cops who had been threatening to gas us over flowers minutes before.
Right, but when it's a right-wing terrorist who drives into a crowd, shoots someone, pulls out a gun and threatens others, very peacefully taken away by police.
Someone they know.
Yeah.
Because it was his brother.
Yeah.
His brother, somebody that was there that day.
So a right-wing terrorist and a police officer in the same family.
Yep.
Okay. And then what was your experience like when some people know it as the Chaz, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, some other folks, the name was changed to the CHOP, right? The Capitol Hill Organized Protest. What was your experience with the CHOP?
I was not there the night that the cops abandoned the precinct. I wish that I had been. But I ended up volunteering in what was called the Healing Justice Space in the CHOP or the Chaz. It was sort of a different, there's like a lot of medics, but this was more like, eclectic or indigenous healing techniques, stuff like that were really prioritized, and I was just like a gopher, basically. But yeah, it was cool to be involved in that aspect of it.
Yeah, what was the atmosphere like at the CHOP while it was going through?
Honestly, it wasn't perfect. 2 people died, Lorenzo and Pocket. But at its best, it felt like the government I've always dreamed of, or the society that I've always dreamed of, like tangible, real. I could walk through it. Like mutual aid, free food, people walking around picking up trash, conversation cafe. It was incredible.
Since the police here in Seattle moved back into the East Precinct and ended the the CHOP, how have things been in Seattle since? Could you talk to folks about like ENDD and what's been going on with all that?
I've actually only been to ENDD once, and that was the time the other night. I know they've been targeting unsheltered people a lot since they closed the CHOP down. There's a lot of unsheltered people still living in Cal Anderson, and they've repeatedly swept those encampments. Yeah, they're just taking their rage out on the most vulnerable of us. ENDD is a march, every night direct demonstration that has popped up in like the last 2 weeks, I think. It's a more pointed approach than the everyday march that runs at night and in the morning. Yeah, we're there a little more direct, I think is a good word, pointed. Yeah.
And so you say like there's a lot of houseless folks in the Seattle area because of the really intense gentrification that's been going on here with Amazon and these other major corporations based here.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit more about your experience as a tenant here in this area and what you've heard from other tenants and just like the cost of rent in the Seattle area?
Currently I live pretty far away from Seattle. I live in an RV, and I pay $600 a month for essentially a parking spot. I lived in Seattle in Maple Leaf for a while. I paid $1,000 for a basement studio, and that was in 2015 maybe. So I'm sure it's only gotten worse since then. Yeah, it's pretty much priced out every minority. In a lot of other vulnerable communities too. And so those are a lot of the houseless people now who have nowhere else to go, and yeah, they're just sitting targets for the police.
How do you envision things playing out in the time ahead with the mutual aid you've seen for houseless people, with ENDD protesting police brutality, with folks organizing in the run-up to the election? What do you see happening in this area in the upcoming weeks and months?
I'm very encouraged by how organized we've gotten in these last, what's it been, 3 months now? Yeah, just the way we have learned to communicate with each other and solve disagreements. I'm very encouraged by that, and if we don't annihilate ourselves in the next year, I'm pretty confident that we'll be able to make a better society.
That's very encouraging to hear. Do you have a message for folks who've been watching? Anything you want to say about the Seattle area? Folks here want to get involved, how they can do so, and for folks who are not in this area, what you think they could do to get involved?
The murder of Charlena Lyles by SPD North Precinct, actually. She was a pregnant woman who was gunned down in front of her 3 children for absolutely no reason. She called them for help because she thought her house had been broken into. They shot her within, I think it was like 18 seconds of arriving on the scene. The police are actually countersuing the family to keep all the records private, so we're lobbying really hard to get them to drop those lawsuits and release the records of, what they did. So yeah, if people out there want to get involved, Charlena Lyles, that's the place to do it.
Alison, thank you so much for making the time to speak to me and to share your experience about what's been going on here with everyone watching.
Yeah, thanks for interviewing.